lot of videos on my channel talking about extinction events. However, there have been events in Earth's history that are kind of the opposite of extinctions. One example of this is the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event, or GOBE. And in this video, I will be talking all about this event and what caused it and what impacts it had on life and Earth in general. First off, what is the GOBE? Well, first and foremost, it's a biodiversification event. So biology, life was diversifying at the time. And yes, life is diversifying pretty much all the time, but we mark this specific event because of its dramatic and rapid increase in diversity during around 485 to 443 million years ago throughout the Ordovician period, really. And so that's marked in this graph by this dramatic increase here, and this increase is just representing number of marine families, a taxonomic group of organisms. It just represents diversity basically, or at least marine diversity. And you can see this is a dramatic upswing during the Ordovician or O period here in the Paleozoic era. And then it drops dramatically. That's the Ordovician mass extinction. And all of these yellow numbers here represent the big 5 mass extinctions throughout the Phanerozoic eon, which I've talked about many times. So what were the causes and the impacts of the GOBE? Well, before we get to what caused it and what it caused, let me just talk a little bit about the events and kind of life that was around leading up to this event and kind of give you guys context in terms of timeline here. First off, we have the Ediacaran Fauna that evolved around 635 million years ago. Then we have the Cambrian Explosion right at the beginning of the Cambrian period, around 541 million years ago, marking the first huge expansion and rapid diversification of animal life, especially skeleton and shell-containing animal life, so animals with hard parts, whereas the Ediacaran fauna was largely soft-bodied. Then we had Cambrian extinctions around 514, 510, 497, and 485 million years ago. Many periodic extinctions because life was still figuring itself out, and so were the oceans, equilibrium, the chemistry, because oxygen had just increased recently. It was a whole thing. I talk about this in other videos, so I won't go into it here, but there were many Cambrian extinctions, so it was still very unstable ecosystem-wise. And then we had the beginning of the Ordovician period right after the Cambrian period. And this marked the beginning of the GOBE, or the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event or trend. Then, like I showed on the previous slide, we had the drop in diversity, which was marked by the end Ordovician mass extinction, and that kind of ended that GOBE event. Now, with each of these kind of stages in animal life evolution, we had what we call different evolutionary fauna, kind of groups or types of animal life that evolved at each stage of these events. So let me just really quick go through each faunal stage, because one of the major impacts of the GOBE was changing or kind of shifting evolutionary faunas from one fauna type to another fauna type. So first off, we had the Ediacaran fauna, which marked the first appearance of large, complex, and diverse animal life, but many were unlike anything today. So they were kind of like before the modern phyla, the modern major groups of animals evolved. And these Ediacaran fauna bridge the gap between the microbially dominated world throughout the entire precambrian to the post-cambrian, the Phanerozoic eon world, where we had the proliferation of multicellular organisms and large complex animals from the Ediacaran and Cambrian onward. And in terms of distinctive characteristics of this Ediacaran fauna type, like I mentioned, most were soft-bodied. They did not have hard parts like skeletons or shells that came in the Cambrian. And during the Ediacaran-Cambrian transition, this marked the disappearance of many Ediacaran fauna and the rise of Cambrian fauna. The Cambrian explosion marked the rapid diversification and skeletonization of animals, with an increase in hard parts like shells and skeletons, and the appearance of modern phyla, at least some, early versions or early species within modern phyla groups. So a phylum is like just below kingdom in the taxonomic categorical, naming system of groups of organisms. And so modern phyla did appear in the Cambrian. However, the species that represented them back then are not necessarily the same as the species that represent them today, but they did evolve. And so that's a little different than the Ediacaran, where most of those major groups went extinct. It was kind of a evolutionary experimentation period, and the Cambrian was kind of, okay, we're finally getting it right. The major kind of increase in skeletonization and producing hard parts of these animals was mainly due to increased predation, competition, and delivery of calcium and phosphorus and other ions to the ocean. There was an increased influx of these ions to the ocean at this time, and this was really important because calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate are typically what skeletons or shells are made of. And so with more ions available, the animals could more easily, more thermodynamically favorably produce skeletons and shells. And so they did. And then after the Cambrian period, around 485 million years ago, we had a transition to the Paleozoic fauna. The GOBE was key to this transition from Cambrian to Paleozoic evolutionary fauna. It basically caused the replacement of Cambrian fauna by Paleozoic fauna, which were rich in suspension feeders and pelagic and swimming animals. They were called the Paleozoic fauna because they remained relatively stable until the very end of the Paleozoic era, at the Permo-Triassic boundary or extinction event that happened at the end of that era, which is the greatest extinction event of all time, called the Great Dying, and I will link the video up to the top corner if you want to check it out. Now, the Paleozoic fauna transition from the Cambrian fauna wasn't necessarily a full replacement. Many groups were the same as the Cambrian fauna, at least like phyla-wise, large group-wise, but the species representing them kind of changed or evolved, advanced. For example, Cambrian fauna included things like trilobites, brachiopods, mollusks, arthropods, sponges, and algae, but these became much more diverse, and their dominant groups or dominant species within these larger groups changed. There was also, however, the emergence of new groups, like early jawless fish, cephalopods, and various other marine invertebrates. The major developments in the Paleozoic fauna include complex food webs, exploitation of new ecological niches, and more intricate ecological interactions. However, I want to emphasize that the GOBE was not global or instantaneous. It occurred at different times in different places. So eventually it was global, but it didn't occur globally all at once. So because of this, it's clear that there wasn't one cause. There were many things that kind of eventually led to this very huge uptick in diversification throughout the Ordovician period, which, keep in mind, spans like 40 million years, so was not instantaneous. So what were these factors that caused the GOBE? Well, one factor, or a few factors, include the dispersion of continents at the time, which would have helped with diversification, because anytime you have dispersed continents, you get a greater isolation, geographical isolation of populations of different species, and anytime there's geographical isolation of populations of species, you get greater speciation, the formation of new species, and diversification. There were also active tectonics and volcanism at the time, as well as high CO2 levels that would have created generally warm and nutrient-rich conditions that favored diversification. So right at the beginning of the Ordovician, kind of early and middle Ordovician, the CO2 levels and temperatures were relatively high, and this fed primary productivity, or phytoplankton and algal blooms at the surface waters of the ocean, which would have produced a lot of food and oxygen for animal life. Now, there is a general overall gradual cooling trend throughout the Ordovician, and I'll talk about that later and how it might have contributed. But what I want to emphasize about these high CO2 levels and temperatures at the beginning of the Ordovician that may have contributed to this diversification event is that Warming is different than warmth. I talk about this in many videos. People ask, well, if high CO2 levels or high temperatures may have been a good thing for diversification in the past, why isn't it a good thing now? Well, like I mentioned in my Why Early Earth Was More Extreme video, it's not the magnitude of CO2 or magnitude of warmth that is harmful ever throughout Earth's history. If it got there gradually, that's fine. It is the rate of change that is harmful, not the magnitude of change. So whenever CO2 or warming or cooling or decrease in CO2, whenever any of those things change rapidly, whether it's an increase or decrease, that is when things are harmful to life because life cannot adapt quickly enough. So just remember that whenever I talk about Earth's history and CO2 levels in the past, they fluctuated all the time. It is only when they fluctuate rapidly that they cause major harmful effects. There is also an apparent association between orogeny and the biodiversification event at this time. Orogeny is just a term that means mountain building event. And so there was a tectonic orogeny, a mountain building event named the Tectonic orogeny during this time, which I talk about in my early Paleozoic geology video. And I'll link that to the top right if you want to check it out. And this may have triggered the GOBE or contributed to triggering it by enabling a greater delivery of nutrients like iron and phosphorus to the oceans, which would have, like the higher CO2 levels, contributed to greater primary productivity and oxygen production and food production for animal life. The changing geography due to the tectonic orogeny and other tectonic events going on at this time would have also led to more diverse landscapes and also speciation by isolation of populations like I talked about on the previous slide as well. However, like I mentioned, over the course of the increased biodiversification trend at the time, there was this gradual decrease in temperature over the Ordovician period. And this global cooling has also been suggested to have potentially caused or in part caused the GOBE. The uptick in fossil diversity correlates with an increase in cool water carbonates over this time interval, as well as just a long-term cooling trend that is indicated by the oxygen isotope record in the rocks at the time. The cooling was likely largely caused by weathering from the tectonic orogeny. The reason weathering causes cooling is because it delivers nutrients to the ocean, which fuel primary productivity, like I just mentioned, and this drives carbon burial. Basically, primary productivity or algal blooms, they take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and when their biomass, their organic matter, gets buried, if it doesn't get decomposed and oxidized, it leads to a decreased amount of atmospheric CO2 and methane because they're taking it up and then getting buried, and that stores the carbon long term in the rocks, and that leads to a global cooling trend. Hello, Editing Rachel here. I realized while editing this video that I explained how the cooling at this time might have been caused, but I did not explain how cooling might cause diversification, or at least have contributed to the diversification event. So briefly, I just wanted to mention that how this would work, at least based on the papers I've read about the GOBE, which I'll link down below, is that the cooling would have contributed to more productive, more active ocean mixing and ocean circulation, because the cooler the poles are compared to the equator, you get more of that cool water at the poles sinking to the deeper water, bringing oxygen-rich water to the deep parts and bringing nutrient-rich deep water to the upper parts of the ocean, feeding this cycle of primary producers and whatever eats them below them and all of that. So ocean circulation and ocean mixing was a big one, keeping the ocean well oxygenated as well, which obviously helped to allow animals to diversify. And then another way cooling might have contributed is because any gradual change, any really gradual over millions of years cooling or warming, gradually drives changes in environments. And because evolution and natural selection, diversification, all of that is ultimately driven by random mutations that either turn out to be beneficial or not beneficial in a certain environment, because it's environmentally dependent, as the environment gradually changes, the mutations that are beneficial gradually also change. And so changing environments, especially because this cooling and diversification was not instantaneous and global, it was different times and different places. This would have allowed for diversification in different times and different places in environments that were changing gradually. So ultimately, across the globe, there were species or different populations of species in different environments that were diversifying in different ways and at different rates. Another potential cause or contribution could have been the Cambrian extinction events that I mentioned earlier. All those Cambrian extinctions opened up new niches for photosynthetic plankton, which had major diversification at the beginning of the GOBE. And these photosynthetic plankton not only decrease CO2 and contribute to cooling, but as they take up CO2, they produce oxygen. And that has also been seen to trend upward with the global diversification trend at the time. And there was a greater diversity of plankton. I'll show a figure later from a paper that shows different species of plankton that diversified at the time and their increase in diversity. And their increased diversity of the plankton also helped to feed animal life and higher, more complex organisms because they are the bottom of the food chain. And so when they diversified, they kind of set off a chain reaction, no pun intended, that helps the rest of the food chain diversify. And this led to just more diverse ecosystems overall. There's also been hypotheses regarding a meteor shower around 467.5 million years ago that may have contributed to the diversification event. This hypothesis suggests that the meteor shower would have reduced sunlight due to increased dust cover right after the impacts, and this combined with ash from the active volcanism at the time may have caused rapid climatic cooling and biodiversification. However, I've seen papers, more so reject this hypothesis. And also, if we actually look at the cooling trend, it's not rapid, which is what would be caused by an impact, is rapid cooling. It's more of a gradual cooling trend over the entire Ordovician period. So it's unlikely that that would have been caused by meteor shower unless it was like a drawn out meteor shower type thing. So I don't know. It's just a possibility or a potential contribution. But it's also important to note that evolutionary innovations and ecological interactions in more complex ecosystems would have also contributed to further diversification. So the diversification itself would have caused this positive feedback loop of more diversification because of the interactions that it causes. For example, as predators became larger, faster, and stronger, prey had to evolve to burrow deeper and faster, to grow shells and hard parts, to have faster mobility in swimming. And so, like I mentioned earlier, all of these things did really increase the diversification during not only the Cambrian, when hard parts first kind of exploded, but also during this event. The further diversification just caused more diversification. So those were all the main causes or potential contributions to the GOBE event, but what were the impacts of the GOBE? Well, you can kind of think of it like the Cambrian explosion produced modern phyla, or at least early representatives of modern, major groups of animal organisms. But the GOBE is what actually eventually filled out these phyla with very diverse and more advanced taxa or species. For example, trilobites, brachiopods, gastropods, and bivalves exploded with diversity during this time. So even though they had evolved by the Cambrian explosion, their diversity greatly increased over the biodiversification event in the Ordovician period. This is the graph I mentioned earlier that I would show later with the phytoplankton and zooplankton increases, and they all kind of decrease at the end of the Ordovician along with the mass extinction event that happened there. But over the early to mid Ordovician, when this event was increasing the diversity of organisms, they were all kind of increasing, as were things like gastropods, trilobites, and ostracods, which are a type of tiny crustacean. However, like I mentioned earlier, there were also new groups that evolved during and after the GOBE, one such group being early jawless fish. Overall, because of the GOBE, the total number of marine orders doubled and that of marine families tripled. Remember, these are just kind of taxonomic group names. As new species exploited new ecological niches, this caused the development of complex food webs, which led to greater ecosystem stability and resilience. And with this increased diversity and complexity of organisms and food webs, also came greater specialization, like taxa began to have more localized ranges, and communities in reefs and deep water communities began to be more clearly distinct from other marine ecosystems. So these organisms began to be a little bit more specialized, and ecosystems began to be more specialized. And so things just overall became more diverse depending on the ecological niche. There was also a profound shift in reef composition, basically from microbially dominated reefs like stromatolite reefs in the precambrian and Ediacaran, which shifted to metazoan or animal dominated reefs like coral and sponge and stromatoporoid reefs from the Ordovician onward. The planktonic realm was also invaded for the first time with invertebrate lineages, and this initiated new food chains to form at the time of the Cambrian Ordovician transition. And as more species were squeezed into the food web and different food webs were forming, you had ecological tiering begin, and that led to more competition and more speciation, or the formation of new species, which led to diversification. So in summary, active tectonics and high CO2 fueled primary productivity, photosynthetic blooms at the ocean's surface, which increased the production of oxygen and food for animal life, and the dispersion of continents, predator-prey relationships, and more complex reef construction drove biodiversification, which itself continued to drive more biodiversification, causing a positive feedback loop of diversification at this time until we had the end Ordovician mass extinction event caused by cooling, glaciation, warming, ocean anoxia, or the lack of oxygen in the ocean. There were a lot of things that caused the Ordovician mass extinction, and I talk about those in my Ordovician mass extinction video if you want to check it out. I will post it up here on the screen for you. And with that, I hope you enjoyed learning about the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event, or GOBE. I'm not even sure if anybody calls it that, but I decided to, so I'm going with it. Anyway, as always, my references are linked in my description box down below, and I can't wait to see you guys next time. Bye.